everyone, bachphotography here, back with another video, so thank you very much for joining me once again. Today we're going to be looking at 3 different lenses and how they all look in the same situation with the same model and the same environment. But before we get into the video, make sure to check out my new ebook on how you can take photos and portraits at nighttime. If you're looking at taking beautiful portraits at nighttime, this ebook and guide is really going to help you take the best photos that you can at night. So the lenses that we shot with this photo shoot were the Sigma 35mm f1.4 art lens, and then the Sigma 50mm as well, and the Sigma 85mm lens. These are often called the holy trinity of prime lenses because they are the prime lenses that are the most useful focal length for most situations in photography, and particularly wedding and portrait photography. So I'm going to leave a link in the description to all of the raw files from this photo shoot so you can have a little bit of a play around with a 35mm photo, a 50mm photo, and an 85mm photo. And I'm going to be editing one of my favorite photos from the shoot at the end of the video, so make sure you stick around until the end and then you can edit along with me. So in this photo shoot, we're shooting about 3 or 4 hours away from sunset. So not the most soft and smooth lighting available. It was quite harsh sunlight, but we did have a lot of overcast clouds, which meant that we still had quite soft light in this photo shoot. And something to think about when choosing which lens to shoot with is also the lighting conditions of your scene as well. Because most people just think, well, I'm going to shoot with an 85mm, for example, because I want to really crop in on my subject. But you also have to consider that if you're shooting on a wide angle lens when shooting in the sun, you're going to see a lot more flaring in your photo when compared to something with a longer focal length. So if you're shooting in a really harsh lighting environment, it actually might be worth shooting with something longer, like a 85mm, because then you can really crop out the sun out of the photo when you're shooting in the direction of the sun, which means that you'll get much less flaring in your photo. Although flaring can be a stylistic choice, so some people like to take photos particularly into the sun because you get some beautiful flaring in your image. So that's really just a stylistic choice, and another thing to think about when choosing the focal length of your camera lens when shooting into the sun. So now here are 3 photos that we took from this photo shoot, one at 35mm, one at 50mm, and one at 85mm. And I shot all of these photos at the aperture of f1.4, just so you could get a better comparison of how all of these lenses perform at their lowest apertures. So let me know in the comments which photo is your favorite, and now let's have a look at all of these 3 photos together. So here are the 3 photos all lined up next to each other, one at 35, one at 50mm, and one at 85mm. And I think the 35mm is probably my favorite one just because we're getting a little bit of light seepage from the sun and a bit of flaring, although it does look quite low contrast compared to the other 2 photos. My second favorite is probably the 85, and I really like how the compression of the 85mm completely blurs out the background and leaves the focus of our portrait, the model, right in the front, separated from the background. I'm not really that happy with the 50mm photo, and maybe if I'd taken a little bit more time with this lens, I could have got a nicer photo, but I think in this situation, the 50mm comes in last. I really like using the 35mm in this particular photo shoot because the background of this photo shoot was really interesting. And there's a lot of interesting shaped cactuses and some nice foliage in the background, so it didn't detract from the photo having that visible in the photo. If you're shooting somewhere that might not be quite as interesting in the background, and maybe the background even has some distraction, shooting on a 50mm or even an 85mm might be a better choice because you can blur out the background and get rid of any of those distractions that are in your photo. But if you're shooting somewhere interesting where there's context needed in the photo and you want to kind of show off where you are and it adds to the photo, shooting wider and at a higher aperture is suitable for those situations. And when you're shooting on a wide angle lens, even shooting at 1.4 isn't going to be very blurry compared to shooting f1.4 on a 85mm lens, because wider lenses don't blur the background quite as much as longer lenses. So what do you think? What is the best lens in your opinion for shooting portraits outside in bright sunlight at maybe not particularly golden hour, but as the sun is sort of setting, where you're wanting to shoot backlit portraits? In my opinion, it really depends on the situation. It depends on how much space you have. Sometimes you're not able to shoot on an 85mm or longer. It also depends on what look you're going for. If you're shooting with a 35mm, you can feel much closer to the subject in the photo and you feel drawn into the subject much more than you would with an 85mm, which makes it look much more like a traditional portrait where you're much more separated from the thing that you're looking at. Now, before we jump into Photoshop and have a look at one particular photo from this shoot, let's have a look at 3 photos, one from each of the lenses, shooting in almost exactly the same position, just so you can get a really good idea of how the perspective of the lens will change how the image looks in the final product. So out of these 3 photos, I think my favorite is the 85mm, purely because it doesn't have any distortion, whereas the 35mm really distorts the features of our model, and the 50mm also does a little bit as well. And I think that the added compression you get from the 85mm really does make this photo look the best, but let me know in the comments what you think. So now let's jump into Photoshop and have a look at the editing on one of the photos I did in this photo shoot. And remember, there's going to be the raw files in the description if you would like to edit along with me, and thank you to everyone who's been sending the photos with their own edits on them on my Instagram. I really appreciate having a look at all the edits you guys do on these photos. Okay, so here we are in Camera Raw, which is a native plugin of Photoshop. We're going to add some clarity to the entire image just because it's a really low contrast, as you can see the sun in the top right of this image. We're also going to mess around with the dehaze, the whites and the highlights, just so we can try to get back as much detail as possible from this image. Now you can see Laura's face is looking a bit orange here, but we're going to fix that in just a second. Now we're going to get the paintbrush tool and we're just going to fix the orangeness of Laura's face after making all those changes. So we're just going to reset this brush tool, remove a little bit of that orange saturation, and also change the color balance so that we can get a nicer skin tone in Laura's face. So make sure you take your time with these little edits, just getting all the colors right and making sure that all the colors, particularly skin tones, all look about the same. So the next thing we're going to do here is just add a bit more contrast back into Laura's hat. Because it was the thing in the photo that was taking the most sunlight, you can see it's really low contrast. But this is something we can fix just by brushing in a little bit more contrast back into the image. So when you're shooting into the sun, one of the things you're going to be doing a lot of is just adding contrast back into areas where the sun has a reduced contrast. So here we're doing the same thing again to the hair. I just made a little mistake there where I hit the hat again a little bit, so I'm just going to reset this change and then try again, just making sure to only touch the hair when I do this contrast change. And that's the thing with editing, you can always, make a few mistakes and always go back. You can try a few different things, see what works, and don't be scared to try new things and try things that maybe won't work the first time, but we'll just take a few times, and getting it right perfect doesn't always have to happen the first time around. So I'm just changing the color as well of Laura's hair to be a little bit more orange, because when you lose contrast, you actually also lose color as well. So now we're going to paint a little bit more boldness and color into the eyes, just to make them pop in the image as well, because the eyes are always going to be the first thing that you look at when you look at a portrait. So we want to make sure that they look nice and bold, so they draw the attention of the viewer of the portrait. So I'm just going to add some overall clarity to this image around Laura's face, and clarity is pretty much just mid-tone contrast. So when you add clarity, it just makes everything in that part of the photo a bit more bold. The highlights are more bright and the shadows are darker. So I'm just adding here a little bit more red and green, because these are the main colors of this photo, and I really want this red dress to pop from the green cactus in the background. Finally, you can see in the top here that the highlights are a little bit blown out, so we're just going to change the color of them to be a little bit more yellow, and that's basically just to make the image look a little bit more warm and a little bit more yellow in general. So that's going to be quite a subtle change. Now let's jump into native Photoshop, where we'll do a few more edits and finish off this image. The first thing we're going to do is just remove a little bit of lipstick that's on Laura's cheek. So we're just going to use the patch tool and circle the area, and then use a content aware deletion by clicking the delete button when we've made that selection. Okay, so that's everything for the lipstick removal. So The next thing I'm going to do here is just liquefy Laura's hair just to be a little bit more thicker, because I think that pretty much with any portrait, if you make someone's hair look a little bit more thick, a little bit more full, it's always going to be more aesthetically pleasing than if you don't. And Laura already has really nice hair, but this is something that you can do with any portrait, I think, to make the hair just look a little bit more thick and full and make the model just look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. So just subtle changes here. Make sure not to warp your image too much and make it look distorted, but just adding a little bit more fullness to the hair really makes a big difference. So I'm just going to hop back into camera raw because I think I just missed something. I just want to add a little bit more contrast into Laura's eyebrows because they are looking a little bit low contrast because we're shooting into the sun. So all these changes are going to be really small, subtle changes that all add up at the end to produce a really nice final product. Okay, so we're pretty much almost done. One final thing I want to do is just make a selection of Laura here. Then we're going to go and click the select button and inverse that selection. So now we have everything selected that isn't Laura. And then I'm going to go to filter blur, Gaussian blur, and just add a couple of pixels of blur, and then move the selection over a little bit just so we don't get a hard line where we've added all this blur. And we're pretty much just blurring the background a little bit more, just so Laura comes right to the foreground of the photo, leaving the background all blurry and creamy. So that's everything for this photo. I really hope that you found this video interesting and I hope you learned something as well. Please leave a like and subscribe if you got to the end and enjoyed this content. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of your edits on Instagram, and I'll see you in the next one.